A report on child poverty in Northern Ireland has been presented to the Assembly. Eradicating child poverty is one of the Executive's and the Government's priorities. But what exactly is child poverty? With me now is Danny Kennedy, who chairs the committee which monitors the First and Deputy First Ministers, and columnist Newton Emerson, who's a bit sceptical about the whole thing. You're both very welcome. Danny Kennedy, first of all, the OFM, DFM, as we call them, Office of First and Deputy First Minister, have responsibility for this. The Government has said it wants to eradicate child poverty. Your committee has produced a report. But what does it all mean?
Well, it means that we all need to be seriously addressing the issue of child poverty by the current measurement, and there is dispute about how poverty and child poverty is actually measured, but it is done on relative income, and therefore it is a measurement that is used throughout Europe and other places and wider afield and generally recognised. But that's indicating that there are upwards of over 100,000 children in Northern Ireland who are affected in some way to a lesser or greater degree of child poverty. The Executive needs to be aware of that, the Assembly has to be aware of that, and between both and between good departmental working and cross-cutting working, we need to address this issue urgently.
So 100,000, 25% of children are poor. But Newton Emerson, it's relative. Is that part of the problem?
No, I think the problem is that pressure from campaigning groups and certain people with political agendas is acting to inflate this figure. Now, Danny is right, this is an absolutely standardised measure, but I think it pays to look at who has standardised that measure. There is in fact no such thing as child poverty at all. Children are not rich and poor in themselves, they experience through their families. And by defining adult poverty, in fact, as below 60% of the median income, you really have here a measure of income distribution. That's what this is about. And 60% median income means that, statistically speaking, in a normal distribution, around a quarter of people will always be below that
so if
level.
you pick this measure, that it'll always be 25% of children or whatever.
Roughly. I mean, what we have here is a Trojan horse for an income redistribution agenda. Now, that's a perfectly legitimate political cause. We might very well all be happier if income was more evenly distributed. But why not just say that? Why do we have to go through this ridiculous emotive, won't somebody think of the children pretense, that this is about children living in some kind of serious deprivation? There are children who live like that in Northern Ireland, but to say that a third or a quarter or 100,000 experience any meaningful level of poverty is absolutely absurd. It discredits the entire issue. It also detracts attention away from the small number of people seriously affected who could be directly helped with a targeted programme.
Does that ring true? I mean, Danny Kennedy, basically it does sound rather strange that if you take it simply as a median, you're always going to have 25% or thereabouts, falling below the line that you've set.
Well, on the current measurement and the way it's measured, it is certainly almost safe to say you can never fully eradicate it. You can certainly alleviate it.
Actually,
so
if the Executive maintains its own measurement, it can never achieve its own objective.
Well, in one sense, yes, but certainly current levels indicate that upwards of about 25% are affected by child poverty in Northern Ireland.
But if we get richer as a society, the average is going to rise, so we're still going to have people who are below the average.
Yes, but you can, as Newton has rightly said, you can introduce programmes and ensure that you at least reduce the percentage of people affected by child poverty. And I think there's also, we need to move the argument on, because a lot of people that I speak to and have spoken to outside of this place seriously doubt whether or not any child poverty exists. That they say it's bad management by the parents, that these are people who won't work and watch
Is the terminology itself
television.
A bit suspect, though? Should we not just talk about poverty?
Well, I think, yes, and I think there are levels of poverty, and I think it's not just a matter that children are wearing poor clothes or not, or have very, very dirty faces and all of that. Poverty is now. We took evidence from the Children's Commissioner, who related a story from a girl teenager who was, in her own right, exceptionally good at art. Now, for her mother to afford the art materials, it was finding that the child didn't want to put the mother under pressure either with her heating bills or her food bills. So the child then chose another subject at school. So that, in one sense, highlights a poverty of opportunity as well.
You've got a lot of recommendations. One specific
We've got
one
47.
is that there should be a Better in Work initiative here, which is something being piloted in England. I mean, what is that, and what difference would it make in practice?
Well, I think in real terms, we need, in terms of the benefits that are available, I think there has to be a greater programme of education to encourage people for the uptake of benefits. There also needs to be the programmes to create meaningful jobs and not just jobs for the sake of jobs. And I think early years, particularly early years intervention, is crucial.
But isn't it the case that I've read the report and it recommends increasing uptake of benefits and bringing in schemes that are tried in England, but essentially the Assembly and the Executive has no real power to make a difference to income distribution. It can't set the national minimum wage, it can't set that regionally, it can't determine the income tax threshold, it can't vary benefit policy in any meaningful extent because none of our parties requested the devolution of those powers. So aren't you really just tinkering around the edges here?
Well, we're not completely at the mercy of the Westminster government, and certainly some of our recommendations indicate that we continue to lobby strongly in terms of many of those issues, but also in terms of the day-to-day departmental work here. There is a cross-cutting issue within health and education, and it's our strong recommendation that OFM, DFM should take the lead responsibility and should have the power of either reward or sanction.
But all these things are trivial compared to being able to do something like, for example, significantly raising the minimum wage or eliminating the benefit trap through the tax system, and you just can't do that.
But Emerson, you've said that this is essentially redistribution, and if it is that, did we all miss something by thinking that the budget was a right-wing budget? Effectively, Sinn Féin can claim to have got a redistributive target within the programme for government.
Well, they can claim to have the target, but they can't do anything about it. They don't have any say over tax policy, and most critically of all, we don't have any say over our social security policy. And it is amazing that this was never requested during a decade of negotiations by any one of our parties, especially when during that time Bill Clinton's regional devolution of welfare model was having astonishing success.
Okay.
But that only involved handing individual states their budget and allocating it around. We haven't even suggested that.
We haven't started there yet. We'll get there another day. Thank you both very much. Thanks, Mark.